Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Lacatos Hayward. I'm an associate in our municipal and environmental law group here at Goodmans. And on behalf of the panel, Kate Lyons, Joe Cosentino, Tom Goth, and Warren Croft, and our team, including Sandra and Carmela, I'd like to welcome you to our program. Now, today we're going to be speaking to you about the new excess soil regulation and how this regulation will impact you and your business. Next slide, please. Now, before I go on to introduce our panel, who I'm sure have much more fascinating things to tell you about soil than I do, I would encourage you to join the conversation today. If you have questions for our panel, please put them in the Q&A box that could be found at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to share any thoughts or comments with the panel or group today, feel free to post them in the chat box. And remember to select all panelists and attendees in the to field if you want everyone to see your comment. Next slide, please. So let me just introduce you quickly to our esteemed panel, who I promise you'll be hearing from very shortly. So there's me, I'm your moderator. Once I've finished my little introduction blurb, you'll be hearing from Kate, who will be taking us through the new regulation. For any of you who have not had a chance to work with Kate, she is a partner in Goodman's municipal law section and head of our environmental law group. She has worked on more brownfield projects than I have time to cover today, but it is wide-ranging and covers everything from redevelopment to remediation to risk management. Now, our next speaker is Joe Cosentino, who is also a partner at Goodmans. And Joe's practice focuses on construction law and construction litigation. But his construction practice is unique in that he's involved a lot in the negotiation and development of complex construction agreements. And so he is able to leverage his litigation experience and really fix problems before they even arise. And today he will be speaking to us about how environmental regulation can impact the construction industry and the interplay between the two. I'd also like to introduce you to two special guest speakers, Tom Goth and Warren Croft. Tom is a principal at GHD Limited and a senior environmental engineer. He has over 30 years of experience in the field and is also an active participant in the province's excess soil engagement group. And Warren Croft is also a senior environmental engineer and a principal with GHD Limited, bringing 20 years of experience in environmental remediation and developing soil management strategies for excess soil. You are all in for a real treat, for these guys are the real experts in excess soils and are likely the people who you probably want to have on site. Next slide, please. Now, I promise you I'm almost done, but it's important to just understand what exactly the new regulation is all about, why we are here today. So first, what is it about? Well, it's a law about dirt. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, when a new condo is developed, a new piping is put in, a municipality completes some regrading work, you have to dig down and excavate significant volume of soil and rocks and haul that soil somewhere else. And that dirt is referred to as excess soils because it's in excess of the site. And as Kate will tell you more about shortly, this regulation is quite broad because it applies to any excess soils generated from a project and which leaves the project site. Next slide, please. Now, many of the people on this list already have project sites where excess soil is generated. And as you'll hear today, some have historically had more of a role in the excess soil game than others. But the new regulation flips the script on that. And so it's important for everyone on this list, whether you're a property owner at a source site, a developer, earthworks subcontractor, a municipality, or a utility, to really understand what the regulation is about and what it will do to your project. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Kate Lyons, and Kate's going to provide us with an overview of the new regulation, where things stand today, and how we got there. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Matt. I was tasked with providing an overview of the regulation. And it's not just a regulation, it's a regulation and some mandatory documents called rules and interpretation assessment tools, sorry. And the good news is that it's actually a simple concept on how it works. The implementation is challenging. So what we're going to focus on today is what you need to do today and what you need to do to get ready for January 2022. So let's start with what it was like 80 days ago before the regulation came into force. So soil was governed, or maybe not, through the waste regulation and non-binding ministry interpretation memos and guidelines, and the testing and record keeping was varied. So what's the simple part? The simple part is the concept. What you need to do is characterize the soil being excavated from a site called the project area. Then you need to create a plan to have the excess soil placed at an appropriate receiving site. And third, you need to maintain mandatory records documenting and tracking the implementation of the plan. So as I said, the concept is simple. The transition is important. As I said, what do you need to do today and what do you need to do to get ready for January 1, 2022, because you're going to need some lead time. So about 75 days ago, one phase of the regulation came into force, and that was that now all soil is classified as waste unless it's managed under the new regulation. So you are able to remove soil from your site and move it to a receiving site today, and you don't yet need to do some of the paperwork and reporting. But by January 1st, 2022, there'll be filing of notices, there'll be requirements for qualified person reports or QP reports, soil testing, sampling, record keeping, and all those requirements will come into force. And then by January 1st, 2025, landfilling excess soil will only be permitted under very narrow circumstances, what we would today think of as hazardous waste and contaminated soil. So before I give very many more details, I want to talk about the new liability framework that comes with this regulation. I'm going to review a whole bunch of reporting and notifying obligations. And what you'll see is that a person called the project leader is responsible for all of those. And under the regulation, they have ultimate responsibility for the planning and implementation under the regulation. And any and all excess soil is their obligation, and you can't contract out of the regulation. Their responsibilities will include supervising the preparation of reports, filing the notice, and keeping it updated, as well as managing the tracking system. So what do we need to do to get started digging by December 31st, 2021, by the end of this year? Okay. So before excavation can begin, you have to prepare specified reports, you need to file a notice, and you need to ensure that tracking system is in place. For the majority of projects, a notice must be filed before excess soil is removed from the site, called the project area. In urban settings, this will often mean that the notice has to be filed before excavation commences. If you have a larger site where you can do some stockpiling, you may be able to do some excavating before your notice, but no excavated soil can leave your site until you've filed a notice. So the regulation doesn't read this way, but in order to file a notice, what's in the notice, the documents or the determinations that need to be put in the notice, require you to have all this work done before you file the notice. And remember, you can't start excavating until that notice is filed. So there's 3 key reports that are required. First of all, an assessment of past uses on the project area prepared by a QP or through a phase 1 ESA. A sampling and analysis plan, again, prepared by a QP, required if potentially contaminating activity was identified through the phase one. And then you need to do the excess soil destination assessment report. Sorry, clearly I should not be permitted to have a mouse that I'm in charge of. Okay, so first of all, I'm not going to touch any further on the requirement for a phase one or a characterization report, because I think most people understand what that is. It's a look at what historically happened on the property and the properties nearby. I'm going to focus more on the other two reports. So the second one is the sampling and analysis plan, or SAP. And based on the findings of the assessment of past uses, you identify the project area locations that need to be investigated. So again, if you have a larger site and there's certain hot spots, that makes sense. If you are excavating for 3 levels of garage to the 4 corners of your site, then that area where you're going to investigate is going to look different. You have to determine in this sampling and analysis plan how you're going to manage and dispose of excess soils. So if soils in one corner are impacted and soils in other corners meet commercial standards, for example, you have to develop a plan that says how you're going to manage them. And you have to delineate the contaminants in the excess soil, or you need to have a plan to delineate them as you excavate. Okay, the soil destination assessment report. I think this is really where, Matt, we're going to see a challenge, because you're going to have to find a place that can take this soil. And remember, you have to do that before you file the notice. And until you file the notice, you can't excavate. So I think this is really where the bottleneck's going to be. In this soil destination assessment report, you have to estimate the volumes and quality. That makes sense. You have to estimate the start and finish date of soil removal, which is interesting because if you don't have an excess site, a receiving site to send it to, making this estimation is going to be a challenge. You have to know the property use at the reuse site, the destination site, and the undertaking for which the excess soil is required. Because what we're going to see in the reg, Matt, is that the excess soil is not supposed to just go and be stockpiled somewhere. It has to be put to what's called a beneficial reuse, and I'll get to that later. The soil quality standards at the reuse site, you have to identify those and confirm that they match the excess soil. And you need contingency measures to be implemented if the excess soil can't be deposited at the reuse site. It could very well be that the reuse site is full by the time you're ready to go, and it can't go there. Alternatively, it could be that you discover additional contaminants before while you're excavating, and it can't go to that reuse site. So you have to have your contingency measures ready. Just a brief comment on the tracking system. It's very detailed. You need the license plate numbers and the identification of the driver in the truck and all kinds of things. This will be managed by your project manager. Okay, so I think this is, for me, the big question. Where is all this soil going? Okay, so the source site, which is called the project area, the soil moves from there to one of these types of sites. Class 1 and Class 2 sites, I'm not going to go into. They are temporary soil storage sites, and some passive processing can go on at those sites, but they're temporary. So from there, you have to move it to one of these other sites. It can go to a waste transfer site. It can go to a landfill, and in the end, only a very small proportion of soil can go to landfill. It can go to a site with an instrument, which might be a pit or quarry, which is capable of accepting soil that has certain parameters, such as salt, for example, but not contaminated soil, certainly. And then I think the majority is intended to go to this site called a reuse site, which is defined in the regulation. And the final placement of soil at that reuse site has to be for beneficial use. Okay, so this is the match.com part of the regulation. The soil characteristics at the receiving site are intended to be matched to the soil characteristics at the project area. Standards in the brownfield regulation apply plus. There's now 18 tables that you have to consider. And I know that our guest speakers are able to talk about that, but they're simply saying that my site meets table 3 under the brownfield regulation doesn't mean that you just go find a table 3 site. It's going to be much more customized than that. If you're not falling within those 18 tables, then site-specific standards can be developed using a tool that the province has provided called BRAT, and I'll touch on that. Okay, the regulation requires the use of BRAT as an assessment tool, and that's the beneficial reuse assessment tool. It allows a QP to develop site-specific standards for concentrations of contaminants at the reuse site. So reuse sites. Excess soil delivered to a reuse site must be used for a beneficial purpose, as I've noted, but unfortunately that's not defined. But they do give examples in the materials. So examples include backfill for an excavation for a development, final grading, infrastructure projects, landscaping, and placement of fill to assist in the rehabilitation of the reuse site. So if it's not for those purposes, the intention is not that you can just go and stockpile that soil somewhere else. Okay, to get ready for 2022, in order to remove soils from a project area, the reports I've discussed have to be prepared, including that you've identified a receiving site in most cases. A notice must be posted, and homes have to be found for an estimated 25 million cubic meters of soil, which is estimated to be trucked out of the GTA annually. I feel like I've driven behind those. That's about 6,800 trucks a day. I feel like I've driven behind every one of those on the 400 series highways. Just a note about the transition. If you've entered into a contract for excavation and removal of soil before January 1, 2022, the new regulation doesn't apply to you. What you must do is have all your excavation complete before January 1, 2026. And also, I should note that if your entire project is residential, institutional, or parkland, and always has been, the regulation doesn't apply to you. So I think that's it, Matt, in terms of my overview of the regulation. And over to you.
Well, that's quite a detailed regulation. We've actually gotten a few questions from the audience that perhaps you can help us answer as well. So I think you may have touched on this, but what would happen if you are unable to find a receiving site where existing soils match the source site? I think you had mentioned there was the possibility of developing site-specific standards and attempting to justify it in that way. Are you still, is that correct?
That's correct. If there's not a receiving site that precisely matches the criteria on the project area, then you'll have to develop site-specific criteria for the receiving site. Something that we haven't dealt with in the presentation, or there's a number of things. There's additional regulations for the transportation, and there's additional regulations relating to the receiving site and who owns it, and there has to be a consent from the owner. There's a whole array of regulation associated with that. And with respect to transition, Matt, I should add that if you've entered into a contract, I think I said the regulation doesn't apply. That's not entirely true. The paperwork, the studies, the plans, that doesn't apply, but you do need to consider appropriate receiving sites in any event, regardless of when you've signed the contract.
And there have been you had mentioned as well that there were a few exemptions under the regulation, and we've gotten several questions about, is there a soil volume that would exempt you? What happens if your property is, for example, residential, but your high rise has ground floor commercial retail? How and when would those exemptions apply?
Sorry to interrupt, Matt. It doesn't matter what you're using your site for, it's what it used to be. So this is not a record of site condition where you're looking at a change in use. This is if you're out doing a subdivision on agricultural land, the regulation won't apply unless there's some evidence that that land became contaminated. For example, it's next to a gas station, then you might need to do some testing. But if your site already is and has been for many years residential parkland or institutional, then this regulation doesn't apply because that soil's just deemed to be, native soil, I'll call it. There are some exemptions. They're very small. Like there's 100 cubic meters, for example, very small amount of excavation exempts you. There are exemptions, but they're generally very minor.
Gotcha. And actually, maybe that's a good opportunity to transition to our sort of next topic, as it seems that this regulation is pretty broad. Is frames liability in pretty broad strokes. And it seems as though it imposes quite an onerous obligation to locate receiving sites. So maybe we can just quickly move to where all of this soil is actually going to go. So perhaps let me open it up. So when should these reuse sites be identified? Who should do so? And what are some potential receiving sites that you could potentially go to? Can you for example take this soil to a dump, pay the fee as you normally would, and just sort of wipe your hands of it?
Hi, Matt. It's Warren at GHD. I think ideally it's a bit of a phased approach where early in the project, the owner and the project leader are working together to identify a variety of options for movement of soil and looking at locations that may be a fit. And as data is generated by the QP and working with the project leader, they start focusing a little bit more, narrowing down what might be an exact match for that type of soil. Some of the options you could be looking at could be other development projects, maybe a project that needs to raise grades, could be an infrastructure project. There's several commercial fill sites that are available in the GTA, and I think there's an expectation that there will be more in the future. And there's also the rehabilitation of pits and quarries under MNRF approval. That's an additional challenge in terms of matching quality, but there's definitely a need for soil to rehab some of those areas. But I think the big piece is starting that process early and trying to understand a broad menu of options before you get too far into your project.
And Matt, if I might just add that I think if some of these subway projects get underway, the amount of excess soil that we're all going to be contending with and finding homes for all of it is going to become an increasing challenge. I don't know if you agree with that, Warren.
Absolutely. And looking at tunneling and subway projects specifically, you'd mentioned rock early as being part of that excess soil framework. If somebody's looking for a home for tunneling spoils from a subway, that material might be rock right now, but by the time it moves, it's going to meet the definition of soil. And that's an additional challenge to deal with in trying to find the right home for that material.
And in finding that right home for the material, is that going to affect the price of fill itself, do you think?
Absolutely.
Okay. As in, will it price go up, do you think? And perhaps maybe this is a question more over to you, Joe. Do you think that this will maybe impact potential contracts for the hauling and import of fill from these sites to these sites?
Absolutely, Matt. I think gone are going to be the days where, it's simply hauled away and from a site and an owner sent a bill. We're going to have to deal with this new world in subcontracts, and or general contracts. Right now, the standard form CCDC2, the CCDC contracts don't deal with this at all. They talk about compliance with laws, and they talk about what happens if you encounter toxic and hazardous substances. But, there's going to be a development of these kinds of subcontracts. And to answer the earlier question about price, I think absolutely fill price is going to go up. It'll be a supply and demand type of situation, right?
So I understand that the current practice today is generally, the general contractor enters into contracts down the line with, your subcontractors, your earthworks, your excavator, your hauler, and they're the ones who kind of get everything sort of pushed down to them to deal with. Under this new framework, do you know who would bear maybe some of the costs of sampling and taking away that soil from site, managing it? Maybe that's a question for everyone, really, about who is the project leader, and what obligations do they have? What can they contract away? What are they still going to be liable for?
Just on the liability front, the project leader is ultimately responsible for everything, and the owner is going to still maintain obligations. And so I'm going to turn it over to Joe, Warren, and Tom to talk as a practical matter how that's going to get implemented. But when an owner and somebody called a project leader have environmental liability, that has to be properly managed contractually and then operationally at the site.
Yeah, Kate, it's Tom. Maybe I'm just going to jump in here a little bit on the project manager side of things, and going back to Matt's first question in terms of who can be the project leader. And just simply, it could be the owner and the contractor. In which way it goes depends on several factors in terms of how the project is set up, where you are with respect to or what stage you are at with respect to the project, and how the work's going to be sequenced, and how things are really kind of defined up front in the roles and responsibilities. Now, we've had some clients, and these are clients that are owners that have, they've come to us and basically said, look, I want to be the project leader because I want to have some control and visibility and transparency in terms of where the soils are going. So on this particular situation, they would go out and prepare the planning documentation. They go retain the QP, and all this information would be, baked into the specifications that goes out to the contractor. It would detail in terms of how the soils are managed, in terms of, these soils are waste soils. These soils can be reused, and it's all laid out for them in the specs. And then there's the tracking piece. Typically what we've seen, it's downloaded to the contractor. The owner can do it also, but typically it's downloaded to the contractor. They'll be responsible for that piece of it. The only tricky situation here is the identification of the receiving site location. As you mentioned, that's a challenge. And, we've only been involved in a few projects where the owner has identified the receiving location right up front. And that might be through either a prearranged contractual arrangement with that receiving facility to ensure that site is available at the time that the work is executed. And so we've very rarely seen those. Typically it defaults to the contractor. They'll provide the location because they've got the resources, they know what's available, and they've got the contacts. But through this whole process, that information is provided to the owner. They review it and approve it, so they've got their hands in the process all the way along. In this type of situation, you typically see that in a design bid build type situation. In another situation, it might be downloaded completely to the contractor. And in that situation, the owner may have just enough information in there to put into the bid to tell the contractor, what can be reused, and, or I should say, how the job should be bid based on the information that they have. But it's up to the contractor to go out and get the detailed information. They got to go hire the QP. They got to prepare the reports. They're going to do all the tracking and the receiving. The owner just kind of receives the information, they review it, and they comment on it. So there's a little bit less control in that situation with respect to the owner's perspective. Okay, but I guess what I'm trying to say at here, or the key message is, at the end of the day, however you set it up, it needs to be clearly defined in terms of who is doing what at the start of the job and in the specifications, so that both the owner and the contractor are very clear in terms of who's going to be responsible for doing what.
And I think that's a really good point. I want to just pick up on something you had touched on sort of at the beginning of your answer, which is on tracking and identifying receiving sites. We've received a number of questions about how excess soil is actually going to be transported and tracked, and in particular, how wet soils are. As you know, perhaps our presentation started from the presumption that all soils would be dry. But what do you do if you have a bunch of wet soil that you've drained from some stormwater management pond that now you don't have time to dry it? You have to just sort of put it in the truck and haul it away. How do you do that? How do you identify? And what does the receiving site really have to do when you kind of have soil that coming in?
Well, Matt, sorry to leap in, only because the stormwater management dredgate came up. There's a specific section of the regulation that deals with that, and it's very specific. So I'm not sure at this point I could give that precise advice. But what I can tell you is if you are dredging a swim pond, there's specific rules for you. But I think that for others on the call, they should weigh in on just wet soils generally and how they will be addressed.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the wet soil piece of it here. And one of the key things in the regulation for that waste designation to come off on the excess soil side of things, it has to be dry. Okay, but in the rules, you are able to do certain types of low risk activities, such as passive dewatering. So the one option you could do is passively dewater it at the site to the point that it's not a wet soil, and then transport it off-site. If you are transporting it off-site as a wet soil, then it has to go to a facility that has an instrument that's able to accept the wet soil. So that's just a couple of key things there.
And then once that soil sort of gets to the receiving site, what are the obligations from the receiving site owner? And in particular, are there maybe also some contractual or contractual relationships that the receiving site owner can sort of do up front to maybe manage their own risk with accepting soils, either wet, dry, clean, dirty, topsoil, fill, whatever sort of comes their way? How do you manage that kind of risk as the receiving site?
So the way the regulation is set up right now, I mean, the majority of the onus is on the source site to ensure that the soil is properly characterized and it's going to an appropriate location. The reuse site, all they really need to do is just sign a declaration that they've received that material. Now, if it's over 10,000 cubic meters, then they do need to register and then inspect the soil. Now, if I was the reuse site, I'd want to look at that information and review it before it got there, just to satisfy myself that material is acceptable to come to my site. Okay. And you could either do that review yourself or go retain a QP to help you walk through the documentation and get that additional level of comfort that material is acceptable.
I agree with Tom. If
Just
I was a receiving site owner, I would absolutely want that to be peer reviewed. Warren, were you going to say something?
Yeah, just to add to Tom's comment, just signing a declaration that you're willing to accept the material does leave you with some liability. You don't necessarily know what you're receiving, and a receiving site needs to, the owner or the responsible party for that property needs to consider if they're really capable of evaluating the appropriate receiving standards and confirming that what they're receiving is appropriate for that site. So who's going to be the one that identifies that the receiving site is a table 1 or a table 2.1 or a table 4.1 receiving site, and then making sure that that incoming soil meets those requirements?
And so perhaps Joe, when a receiving site, takes in that soil, does that potentially open up some new avenues of liability for the project leader? Can the receiving site owner, do you think that may give them some avenue to say, bring actions against them? And is there anything that, maybe the project leader can do on their end to manage that risk? Like, is that covered maybe by insurance or
It's going to be interesting whether and how the insurance market sort of adapts to this new reality. The receiving sites, who is the project leader is going to be one of the key questions, right? And that liability is going to be a primary concern. And I think we're going to see a lot more information at the bid stage now. That you got to figure out the name, location, all this type of stuff about your reuse site. I know right now there's a pilot project out in Peel this year where they're actually getting the contractors to do the tracking and the testing to see how it goes. So there's got to be a lot more of this pre-planning. I think I'm going to be seeing in my world, because then you're going to have, if not, you're going to have a lot of impact on construction schedule. And you're going to have to try to, mitigate the risk to your schedule. And again, what's going to happen? Your who the project leader is has a lot of potential liability ascribed to it, Matt. So we're going to see that, and I also think that, touching again on this sort of pre-planning stuff, like, you got to know the results and the assessing the results and getting all these approvals. It's going to be a new regime for contractors and for, what I'll call little guy subcontractors. And are they able to, do they have the ability to be the project leader? If the risk is downloaded to them, that's going to be a key consideration.
And perhaps maybe on that subcontractor piece, do you think we're going to start maybe seeing some new subcontractors arise, new industries maybe? I know that there's maybe a few firms out there already that, can track excess soils coming in. Do you think that that's going to lead to a new industry of tracking soils, of managing soils on site to try and...
There may be a middleman industry, if you will, about, can you help me find a reuse site? I think that'll come up. There may also be some practical stuff on the design side. Maybe we're not going to excavate in exactly the traditional way anymore. Maybe we'll do it hydrovac or another method of digging to try to lessen the amounts of excess soil. We're going to have to see how this gets impacted in the next several years.
And just something to add on that. Elements of that middleman industry and the soil broker industry already exists, and it does help move soil fairly quickly through construction projects. And part of the ministry's intent in all of this is to provide more visibility. So who's involved and who's taking responsibility, and ultimately where is that soil going?
And Warren, I was going to ask you and Tom a question, which is lots of our clients, just to diligence a site, are doing maybe preliminary geotech and some geoenvironmental soil and groundwater testing. How early would you want to get a project manager involved? Can that data be used to assist in the preparation of the plan? Would it be a good or bad idea to get your geotech or your environmental consultant to become a project leader or be the QP supporting the project leader?
I think it's important to get some of that data early. One of the challenges in the regulation is that the data becomes stale data at some point. And if you do your geotechnical and environmental due diligence prior to the design, because you're trying to develop your geotechnical and foundation designs, maybe it's 2 or 3 years later that the soil is actually moving. So by then, your data is stale data. So I think there's a need to do some element of due diligence sampling with your environmental and geotechnical due diligence. Maybe you assess that data to the site condition standards that apply to the source site, but also consider that data relative to receiving site soil quality, just comparing it to maybe a menu of tables to help somebody understand what they might have. And then further sampling is going to need to be done later. And then that becomes a contractual and responsibility piece. Is that going to be the general contractor? Is that going to be the owner? Is that going to get downloaded to a QP retained by a subcontractor? You know, those are the challenges that you really need to work through. But I would add, for right now, we're in 2021, some of the elements around responsibility and liability for soil management, those pieces do exist right now, even though some of the requirements around documentation, sampling, and tracking are not in place. And how are you going to demonstrate that you were diligent and that you found the right receiving site if you didn't generate any data, you didn't track it, you didn't report on it, and you didn't get approval of the receiving site owner? So that's something to consider.
That's an excellent point that relates, Matt, to this transition. Those rules may not apply that require you to do the tracking, the data gathering, et cetera, until January 1, 2022. But as Warren said, what are you going to do? You know, how are you going to establish that you've done it all right?
I was just going to say that was an excellent transition into sort of the next big question is, you know, you have all this liability that you have to worry about, all these contracts that you have to draft, these relationships now with municipalities, utilities, receiving sites, and you have maybe a year to do all of this. What do you need to have in place by 2022? And you know, how do you go about actually filing notices, getting all that information in place so that, you know, when it comes time for 2022, you're not stuck with sort of soil on site that you can't move or get rid of it, essentially?
Just from the contractor or subcontractor perspective, like those folks are going to have to get a lot better at record management, right? Like, you know, that gone are going to, again, you're not going to have these simple haulage tickets anymore. You know, everything needs to be signed off. It needs to be recorded. You know, your trucks are going to have to be GPS tracked, and you know, it really can't be that sort of haul it away mentality and worry about it later. And I'll let the rest of the panelists speak to the balance of your question, Matt.
Yeah, I think in terms of documentation, there's a need for a sampling and analysis plan. There's a need for an assessment of past uses. There's a need to gather data, need to prepare destination reports. It's several months of work. And then there's going to be the registration piece. And right now the registry doesn't exist. So we have some idea of what it might look like, but that's a bit of an unknown. But I think there's several months of work at a minimum to make sure you're ready for January 1st.
On the ministry side, sorry, Kate, just quickly, is the ministry, is there going to be a specific branch of the ministry that's going to be managing that, or is it going to be a new branch that's set up specifically for excess soil?
Well, that's a great question, because how the ministries get resourced is always a key issue. I know on the record of site condition side of things that the timing, just the backlog of risk assessment reviews going on at the ministry, it's just they're not well enough resourced to handle the volume. The registry is going to be a new registry, Matt. I don't know how it's not going to be the registries that we work with now. So I don't know how they're going to resource this, because it's intended to be rest on the shoulders of the project leader. But in terms of what we need to do to get ready, as Warren said, it's a number of months. And as you can tell, my concern is, are we going to be able to find sites that actually need fill? And we've got these 18 tables now, 9 of them new, that we got to figure out. So it's not just kind of take the data that you already have, because maybe you were going to get a record of site condition. So you just take that and put it in a different package and you're good to go. The assessment of the sites where it's going to land is going to become, in my view, critical. And I think that's going to be the challenge. And so you got to have a plan B, which I think means, and in fact, your report has to have a contingency plan in it. If while you're excavating, you discover contaminants that were not identified originally, that has to go somewhere else. And by the way, the project leader has to update the registration. That's an ongoing obligation. Then you've got to find a spot for that. And what if the receiving site is full because they don't have any obligations? They can say, look, this guy showed up, he had the paperwork, I let him put the soil on the site. I think that's going to be the backlog. So if it were me, I'd be out looking for a menu of receiving sites right now that could manage not only the volume, but the volume at the rate, because we don't want to stop our excavation partway through and go looking for another site. I think that's the key thing. I think that people like Tom and Warren can get these reports pulled together and organized, and the data tracking system in place. Not that I'm, trying to turn them into project leaders if they don't want to be, but I think the real issue is locating the receiving sites.
And what happens though if you're really struggling to get that receiving site and figure out where it is? Is it possible to say, you dig up the soil, you hold it on site, or you take it to some offsite temporarily, and then you bring it back and reuse it? Are you still to that extent subject to some of these requirements under the regulation? Is that allowed? And what would kind of be entailed by trying to just reuse soil on site?
Well, Warren and Tom, why don't you talk about that from a practical point of view, and then I can follow up with the regulatory part. And I don't know, Joe, if that has implications, because for sure it does to construction timing.
Yeah, so there is a provision in the regulation where you can take the soil to a temporary location, but you can take it to the temporary location, but where it finally ends up going has to be known by the time it gets to that temporary location. You just can't take it to the temporary location and then sort of try and figure out where it can go. So it's meant in those situations where you do have a reuse site identified, but you just can't get it there right away. So you can temporarily store it until that receiving location is available.
Sorry, Tom, in speaking with a contractor client as recently as yesterday, I'm led to believe that there's going to be like some real life schedule impacts when this comes into play, because what's going to happen is, these dumps close at 5 p.m., let's say. So your last dig of the day is going to be at 3:30. And can you still overnight the soil at the contractor's yard or something like that? So you're going to have a real impact on working hours, and our owners and our municipality owners, maybe you got to think about extending the number of working days that a project might take because of this.
Right. And when I was talking about the temporary location, Joe, I mean, this is when the reuse site might not be available for a few months, right? It's not by the day. The other thing I might want to point out, and I know this was gaining a little bit of traction a couple of years ago when there was drafts of the regulation that were being released. And I know some contractors kind of saw the opportunity here, and they initiated processes process to get an approval for commercial fill sites because they knew that they needed to find a place to put the excess soil. Now, and there's a couple of them that have been approved, but unfortunately, I mean, that's generally done through the municipal level, and the approvals are generally much more rigorous. So it takes a bit of time to get those sites approved. But I'm just starting to see, those are starting to gain traction. The other thing on the licensed pits and quarries, I know they're kind of limited right now through their policy on Table 1. I know there's discussions with the MECP and the MNRF with respect to whether the MNRF is going to adopt the quality piece of the regulation, meaning the generic tables, into their policy. So that might open up a little bit more room there for the acceptance of reuse soils, but it's just a dent in the 25 million that Kate was talking about. But it's a start.
And what about, I know a lot of our conversation today has been about, your typical kind of construction excavation. How is this going to impact, say, utility or municipal road development projects, where you have to tear up the asphalt and the concrete and move that aside while you reset the road, or where you're a utility upgrading infrastructure and using certain augering methods to get down there? Is this regulation going to apply to any soil excavated in those cases, or is it dependent really on the specific circumstances in that case?
It depends on the specific circumstances, Matt, but the regulation does provide certain limited exemptions for infrastructure projects if you're going to be using the soil somewhere in the infrastructure project. So if you're pulling stuff out to do work and then you're going to put it back in either where you took it from or somewhere farther down the line, there are specific exemptions in the regulation.
Gotcha. So I know we could probably spend an entire day talking about this regulation and just barely scratch the surface. But I am being mindful of the time and see we probably have 7 or so minutes left. And there's exactly 7 questions from the audience that are left. So I figured this may be a good time to just reach and sort of move to our conclusion and maybe answer some of these questions as we go. So one of the questions that I've seen here is, how is this a lot of these sort of the discussion has been on these big excavation fill projects, and how is this though going to impact sort of smaller projects, ones that maybe are not small enough to be exempt from the regulation, but not big enough that they can put all these sophisticated, risk management systems in place? How can they manage their own risk without, spending more money or a disproportionate amount of money on these sort of projects?
Good question, Matt. I think there's some flexibility that's been provided for municipalities. So if a municipality or their contractor is doing work, there is some room to reuse soil. There's an opportunity for a public body to create different types of soil management sites. I do think it's going to be a challenge, though, for small contractors working for private owners. Because I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to source receiving sites, even where there's exemptions that apply in the regulation. Logistically, I think it's still going to be tough to work through.
Gotcha. Kate, I know we had talked about previously a quote unquote residential exemption. I just had a question from the audience about a clarification. Is it that the current use residential sites based on obvious use and or phase 1 determinations that are exempt, or is there something more to that? And what happens if you have like a golf course property that the zoning has previously said it's residential, but now it's a golf course? Is that exempt?
Well, that's a very specific set of facts, but it's like the records of site condition. It doesn't really matter what it's zoned for. It's what is it used for. So, and what is it used for now before you start excavating? And the idea is that if it's residential or a park or agricultural, and it has been for a long time, you go back and you look at the air photos, and before it was a residential subdivision, it was agriculture, then you're fully exempt. So that's how that works. I don't know how specifically a golf course would work, but I think what you'd have to do is look at that document of past uses and determine whether there are any areas of potential environmental concern. So others may have also comments on that.
Yeah, the only thing I just wanted to add, Kate, and I think you just touched on that at the end, it depends on whether there's a potentially contaminating activity associated with the site in addition to the current and past use. So.
Gotcha. I think we have probably time for two or so more questions. There's an interesting question from the audience about sort of the overlap between this new excess soil regulation and Ministry of Labor standards is under the MOL, the contractor is generally deemed to be the quote unquote constructor. Would the constructor, depending, I guess, if the constructor meets the qualifications to be a project leader, what's their liability, and how does that intersect with Ministry of Labor regulations?
So my understanding, Matt, on the MOL side of things, yes, they're the constructor, and they're in care and control of the site with respect to the safety of the site and to ensure they've got the proper safety protocols in place. It doesn't necessarily apply to the management of the excess soils, but they are they are in care and control with respect to the health and safety aspects of the site.
And so I think we probably have time for one more group of questions, and I guess following Kate's excellent presentation, I think I'll end it on a big question mark, which is, where does all this go? I think there have been a number of great questions from the audience about receiving sites and what are their obligations? What sort of, apart from the declaration, what are the notices that they have to provide? Are there interesting other types of regimes that can be set up? Can, for example, the owner of the project area, can they buy some empty parking lot somewhere and treat that as a receiving site?
So on that first one, Matt, I mean, if they're going to do that, then they'll have to get the necessary approvals through the municipality to do that, and that's typically through a site alteration bylaw permit, or it could be through a site plan approval process. So it depends on the municipality, but they'll definitely need an approval.
Right.
And that approval is, Matt, remember that receiving sites, there has to be a use for it at the receiving site. It can't just be that I'm going to go and store it on a parking lot as a stockpile. That's absolutely not allowed. So if an owner had another site and there was reason that site needed grading or rehabilitation of the site, whatever that means, then that would be a good idea. And as Tom said, you would have to, the use would have to be permitted. So let's say you're going to make a mini putt, that has to be permitted, but then the site alteration bylaw has to be complied with. And if you need permits, then you need to get them.
Well, despite my best efforts, we still have a few questions left from the audience, but unfortunately, we've reached the end of our timing. I'd like to, just before we conclude, I'd like to thank everyone here for their excellent presentation and thought-provoking conversation. Big thanks to Tom and Warren for taking the time to join us this morning. Special thanks to Joe and Kate as well for helping this, and even more thanks to the team behind the scenes, Sandra and Carmela. who we couldn't have done this without you. So big thanks from you guys on your end. For the audience, if you have if your question perhaps was not answered, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to try and answer your question, work through the problem that you may have, and hopefully come to a solution. But I think we should perhaps wrap it up for today. If you have some time at the end, please feel free to fill out our survey, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.